Alright, this video is going to be a little reminder of inverse trig functions, emphasis on it being a function. So if you guys recall, when we look at sine and cosine and tangent, and we talk about the trig functions, we had specific domains that we had to use for any time we used an inverse trig function. So if we had sine inverse of x, the domain for this graph was from negative pi halves to pi halves. That should be a bracket. Which means that for us we used answers that were in quadrants 1 and 4 for sine inverse. And because the domain was negative pi halves to pi halves, we had to make sure that quadrant 4 answers were written using the negative version. Alright, when we looked at cos inverse of a value, we found that the domain here was from 0 to pi, and so that was quadrants 1 and 2. And the nice thing about cos is that it doesn't have any negative angles, and so you can just use the angle that you see in quadrant 1 and 2. And then for tan inverse, we found that the domain here was from negative pi halves to pi halves, which is quadrants 1 and 4, and we do not use brackets because up here at positive pi halves, the point up here is 0, 1, and tangent would be 1 divided by 0, which is undefined, and down here it's 0, negative 1, and negative 1 divided by 0 is undefined. So if you tried to use the ends, the negative pi halves and the pi halves, you would just get that your answer was undefined. So here the domain is the same as sine, it just does not include those endpoints. So basically the thing that we have to remember is that when we're doing sine and tangent, we can use quadrants 1 and 4, and we do have those negative angles we have to be careful of when we see an answer that's in quadrant 4. And then for cos inverse, we use quadrants 1 and 2. So that's the part of these problems that you have to memorize. So first, we're just going to do a very simple example. Let's say we're doing cos inverse of negative root 2 over 2. So here, I'm going to look at my unit circle. Anytime I do cos inverse, I just have to remember if I'm doing cos inverse of a ratio, so the ratio is between two sides, my answer is going to be an angle. So cos inverse of those sides, I'm looking in quadrants 1 or 2. I'm completely ignoring quadrants 3 and 4. And I'm looking for where an x-coordinate is negative root 2 over 2. And so that's right over here, negative root 2 over 2. And my answer here would be 3 pi fourths if they want the answer in radians, and 135 degrees if they want the answer in degrees. And they pretty much always want the answer in radians, which is why we're using the unit circle, because if